Unwieldy hair. Wow. Right. So not many people here yet. We'll wait for more people. So make sure my sound is, yeah, okay. So according to my phone, we've got about 2 more minutes before we should get started. So I'll hang on for a little bit longer. Right, 1 more minute. Yeah, Gracie, actually, I wouldn't mind doing that at all because, well, I was going to wait until everybody was here, but today's going to be probably kind of short in terms of content. Reason is I'm just feeling a little bit under the weather. Nothing serious, but I canceled a class yesterday owing to just not feeling well. So today we're just going to look at the first section of chapter, I believe it's chapter 6, Perceptual Theories. So yeah, actually we do have time to go over some of the main themes from the last 3 weeks for reading response 3. I should say also, as usual, I'm not exactly where I want to be with grading progress, but I am going to have everybody's feedback available before response number 3 is due. So everyone will be able to view their feedback and understand, you know, how they can sharpen their game up a little bit, just like last time. So I'll just share my screen so that everyone can see. Oh, thanks, Gracie. Yeah, I hope I feel better too. It's not COVID or anything. It's just, you know, when you get tired and overworked, you get tired, and then your immune system kind of gets tired too, I suppose, right? So yeah, I guess it's about time we get started. So let's just get the slideshow going, and then we'll stop. Before we start, rather, we can reiterate some of the themes that we've covered in the previous chapters. And this would be a good opportunity actually for everybody to jump in, because the material is rather dense, and some people might find some themes, some ideas, some concepts a little bit easier to digest than others, whereas others find things easier that the other people found more difficult. So let's see, just having everybody join. Oh, hello. Hello. Trying to teach, sir. Yeah, we were also out of town for a little bit, so you know, these guys had the place to themselves over the weekend, and you know, I think they missed us. They say that cats don't care when you leave, but I don't believe that. Oh. So this guy, anyway, he's much less shy than his brother is. Hey, buddy. Oh yeah, certainly. I agree. My previous cat, Spinner, was almost like a dog in the way that he'd follow you around. Very weird, but very awesome, right? Yes. Okay. So let's see. I'll just keep the chat open up here, and I'll keep the videos over here. And yeah, we can probably take a few minutes just to go over some of the things that you might want to, I don't know, maybe refresh your memory on. One thing that strikes me that's worth discussing is the evaluative judgment theory stuff, because that's kind of been, up until now, the main way that the authors have treated emotions. And there have been a number of different variations of this that we've talked about. All of them kind of fall under that umbrella, where emotions are some kind of value judgment. And we saw two different versions of this, where it's a judgment and then a feeling that follows from the judgment, or a feeling with a judgment tacked on. What we're going to do today, as we'll see, is get into perceptual theories, and perceptual theories focus mainly on the felt qualities of emotion, and not so much on judgments that may accompany them or constitute them. And in that way, they're kind of advantageous, because one of the issues with evaluative judgment theories is that they don't really pay that close attention to the phenomenology. And obviously, I think, as the author stated at the opening of this chapter, ordinary language is, you know, replete with examples of, you know, how we place. It shows us how we place the phenomenology or the felt quality of emotions very centrally when it comes to understanding what they are. The evaluative judgment theories don't really do that, right? So that's one thing that it strikes me that it would be good to be aware of, to talk about, perhaps for critical response number 3. Another thing, before I open it up to everyone else, is that if you want, and I'm saying this because of the range of very interesting possible essay topics that people were coming up with when we did our essay writing workshop. Don't be afraid to start testing the waters If you have an idea, I know you haven't written your topic proposals yet, but critical response 3 can always be yo-yo. Critical response 3 can work as a way of testing the waters and maybe trying to develop some of these ideas that you're maybe thinking of. So if you're worried that the material is very dense, the material that we've covered since reading response 2, and you're thinking that, oh, I don't really know what I should choose to talk about, or you're finding it hard to zoom in on a very small idea that you can actually discuss in the space that you have, then it's fine if you want to try and explore something else and relate it to what we've discussed, or something that has stuck with you. So that's what I'll say about that. And I'm just wondering if there's any other important themes that seem salient to any of you that maybe will help everybody refresh their memory. Chelsea raised a hand. Yes.
Hello, how are
Hello.
you? I came in a little bit late, but I hear you're not feeling so well.
Oh, it's nothing serious. Just I just think exhaustion,
Yeah,
maybe.
once you got like a moment to relax, kind of, your body was like, "Hey,
Yeah, after that I was like, no, you're not doing anything else now.
nothing
So
left." Yeah,
yeah.
that's how it works. There we go. Welcome to November.
Yeah.
I have actually been, I went like full on crazy student mode today, got like the whiteboard out and have been going over all the other chapters before getting to this one because I've just been trying to suss out like some of the confusing parts. And one
Right.
of which that I landed on, one of them is that I thought this is gonna sound, I don't know how to word this in a way that doesn't make me look like an idiot, but I thought we were talking about emotional value judgments, and then there was a whole other chapter on emotional value judgments, and we weren't talking about it before, but they had dedicated a whole chapter to values.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you
What did I
mean.
miss? What am I like? We talked about, I guess, the desire and stuff, but that was chapter 3, not chapter 4. So what am I missing?
I would have to bring up the textbook um, to refresh myself on that. I do recall that.
Oh, I mean, like the fitted attitude analysis or determinism, not determinism. Jesus.
Well, yeah, there's the fitting attitude analysis. There's
Dispositionalism. That's what
yeah,
it is. Yeah.
dispositionalism. Um, what else? What else? They had, oh, it's right there. Curse my sleepy brain. Um, Something about, oh, the desire, satisfaction, frustration model is
That was,
about, yeah,
yeah.
that's a little earlier though. That's all
Yeah.
about how desires fare. Um,
Subjectivism turned into dispositionalism and fitted attitude analysis. So I
mhm.
thought these were evaluation judgment things, but then we have a whole separate theory that's evaluative judgment theory.
Yeah. Well, they're all evaluations in a sense,
Okay,
right?
right.
Like if you're looking at whether your desires are satisfied or not, you are making an evaluative judgment. But I
Mm-hmm.
guess the confusion kind of arises because they use evaluative judgment in the sense of evaluating something, and they also use it in the sense of making a value judgment, right?
Okay.
like like
Yeah.
like like if my emotions are uh
Mm-hmm.
representations of how my desires fare, well, that's just like, oh, if I'm sad, perhaps it's because something I desired not to lose was lost.
Right.
um but then they also talk about evaluative judgments, like in terms of aesthetics.
Right.
Almost, it's almost like an aesthetic thing, where they're talking about the admirable painting and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah.
So that could be where that kind of lack of clarity is coming from, I
Yeah.
suspect.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense when you put it like that. It's yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
no problem. Anything else? it may, wow, it may actually be to everyone's benefit to sort of skim over the old slides, whatever notes you've taken, and even just the intro and conclusion sections of all the chapters we've read so far before you actually set down to tackle critical response 3 or the essay proposal or the essay itself, right? It's always good to sort of refresh yourself. I imagine like reading week is a good time to do this, but it's also kind of one of those times when you don't, just because you've probably all got 4 other classes like this, and so it's not like, oh, you should have done this over reading week or anything, but it might be helpful. That's just a suggestion. It's something that I'll probably do before I grade the 3rd critical response, for example, because we've gotten past a lot of the earlier stuff that you could have talked about in 1 or 2, like all the phenomenology and intentionality stuff and beliefs, desires, all of that. The basic philosophy of mind stuff is fairly simple. But then when we get into the different theories of emotions proper, that's when we feel like we're being maybe like wandering through the confusing pathway of philosophy, right? The dialectical thickets, as they say. So yeah, that's a suggestion. But if anyone has some, Chelsea has her hand up again.
Yeah, just if I can ask one more question.
Mhm.
Doxastic, relating to belief, correct?
Right. Yep.
Okay. But then I confused myself because I Googled it, and it's people started talking about it's how it's modal.
Yeah. Modal is just like modal logic is an area of logic,
Right.
and it deals with possibility.
Okay. That's this.
It is in the sense that, so if you're doing modal logic, you talk about like, what does this person possibly believe, like if he believes this or if he believes that, or what that will cause him to do. It's all about possibility. But we call those states doxastic states when we're doing like modal logic. It's more rigorous than the idea of a propositional attitude, which is something we kind of work with every day on the fly when we're like folk psychologizing one another, right?
Okay.
So doxastic states are, they map onto propositional attitudes. So belief is a doxastic state and a propositional attitude. But if you were talking about it in modal logic, it would be a more rigorous sort of treatment of that state than in like a folk psychological analysis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. Because there was a couple. I don't know if it was the modal part of it or the doxastic part that had a few different, depending on if you're looking at it from logic or not.
Right.
So I wanted just to clarify that with you. So perfect. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. Any other questions about previous material, or any kind of recap that anybody wants to do before we get to the start of chapter 6? Well, that's okay. I mean, if anyone thinks of anything along the way, we will almost certainly have time after the lecture is finished to talk about it, because as I said, I've sort of limited myself for today, at least, just to the first bit, the first section. So we'll talk about that now, and this is going to be fun because it's all to do with the James-Lange theory, mostly James, but so like I mentioned a little while ago, all the different theories of emotions that we've talked about thus far don't really deal with phenomenology in the way that maybe a theory of emotion needs to deal with phenomenology. I mean, as I said, yo-yo, you're in the way again. As I said previously, the authors are quite right to point out that ordinary language shows us the sort of central role of felt quality that we think of as typical of emotions, right? I mean, in everyday parlance, we call them feelings, right? So, one example is, of course, the evaluative judgment theories. These treat emotions like judgments, but emotions are also something we experience, and we can't just easily assimilate them into judgments because of that. Because when we make a judgment, there may or may not be something that it's like to make that judgment. It might be accompanied by an emotion, but there are certainly judgments we can make that this is not the case for, right? And indeed, we might wonder why we we might start to wonder, as the authors talked about previously, why we would want to talk about judgments at all. And this was the whole thing about the example of the blue vase, if people remember that one. Like, if there's a theory of perception that was based on judgments, that would just be redundant. Maybe something is true in the same way for theories of emotions. Maybe we just can't assimilate them into judgments the way that some theorists want to. So we've talked a lot about things like intentionality. We've talked about epistemology, so what emotions are about and how that can help individuate emotions. That's the intentionality, of course. We've also talked at length about epistemology, that there are standards of correctness and justification for emotions. But other than offering up examples of, Jonas feels this way, Mary feels that way, and that kind of thing, we haven't really talked about phenomenology all that much. And I'm kind of excited to get to this point in the text where we finally get to do that. And we'll do that by briefly examining William James's theory of emotions. And James, of course, emphasizes the felt quality of our emotions. Now, this theory does have a number of virtues. I'm a really big fan of Jesse Prince's modified version of this theory, the James-Lange theory. In Prince's book, and this may be helpful when it comes to some of your essays, Prince sort of gives us an updated, modernized version of the James-Lange theory, a sort of hybrid almost between the James-Lange theory and Lazarus's cognitive appraisal theory. So if you want to take a look at a modern version of this sort of thing, and the authors do talk a little bit about it, but if you want the full scoop, Jesse Prince's book is very good. And there's a couple of other books I'll mention along the way today too. So I like this theory. I have to admit, I am kind of biased towards perceptual theories. But James's theory specifically does have some shortcomings. Even though other theories we've treated, like desire satisfaction or evaluative judgment, they don't try and explain the phenomenology enough. James's theory does. However, what James's theory doesn't do is give us a good account of the links that we've observed between the judgments that accompany emotions and the felt qualities of emotions. Because it seems true that, even though emotions, at least if ordinary language, if what it tells us is correct, are very much like, just feelings, there are also judgments that accompany them. Those judgments might in some way be tacked on, or they might precede the emotion, or they might be constitutive of it along with their felt quality. But there is some important link between these felt qualities and the evaluative judgments. And James's theory doesn't really do enough to make these links clear, to help us understand what they might be. So that's one of the shortcomings that contemporary thinkers like Prince or like Antonio Damasio, that's one of the shortcomings that they are trying to address in their work. And I'll talk a little bit about how Prince does this. later on if everyone is curious. But, we encountered this theory during our first lecture, our very first lecture. And nowadays it's known as the James-Lange theory of emotion. William James conceived of this idea in the late 1900s, and then Carl Lang in the 1920s came up with a very similar theory of emotions. The authors describe it thusly. They say James's theory considers an emotion to be the subject's feeling of bodily modifications triggered by his apprehension of certain objects or facts. So basically what that means is that emotions are just perceptions of changes in our bodily states, in our somatic states, in response to events, objects, scenarios, whatever eliciting things are out there in the environment. As James himself wrote back in 1884, my thesis, on the contrary, is that the bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, and that our feeling of the same changes, as they occur is the emotion, right? So our perception of the change in our bodily state when something important happens is the emotion, right? And remember, we did this little thought experiment. If you think of an emotional episode you recently experienced, you can use that. Or perhaps you're experiencing an emotion now, and you can use that one. I almost thought I would elicit an emotional response in all of you thusly, but I decided not to do this. I decided it might not be ethical. I decided what I could do is just tell you all, okay, everybody's going to lose 10% off of all of their grades because of some error I've made, right? And you'd have an emotional reaction that you could study, but that wouldn't be very nice. So I'm not doing that. But I thought, this is one of the kinds of events that would elicit, yeah, right? It wouldn't be good. So we won't do that. But if you want, you can think back to like the surprise party. Did I do the surprise party example in lecture 1? I think I did. Or you can think of any emotion you experienced recently. I experienced frustration because confused cry. Yes, that's a complex emotion, perhaps sadness and confusion. So, and we haven't even gotten to complex emotions yet. So, but yeah, this morning and yesterday, I was feeling very frustrated. Frustration is certainly an emotion. And I was frustrated because I wasn't feeling well. I was out of town and I had to make it back here to teach the class over the weekend. So, or not teach the class over the weekend. I was away over the weekend, had to get back here. So then I get word that my landlord has to come and do another inspection. And, we've had myriad inspections and intrusions here owing to water problems, insurance reasons, lots of stuff. And I'm just kind of like, oh man, like how many more of these do we have to do? Like, so I'm feeling pretty frustrated, right? Now I try and subtract away all of the changes in my bodily state. So I get that email, oh, we need to come and take a look. And I'm in Toronto, like, oh, come on, man. I don't want to worry about this when I'm not at home. So I feel frustration, I feel a kind of tenseness, maybe a little anxiety too, and there's something that it's like to experience those things. And when I take those away one by one, like if I take away that sort of that twinge in the face, or maybe that elevated cardiovascular pulmonary response, what's left? Just a judgment, basically, right? There's nothing left when you subtract the phenomenological stuff except a judgment. And you can try this with other emotions as well. So if anyone wants to offer an example, that would be fine. If not, we can move on. But think of basic emotions, right? I'm not sure how basic frustration is, But what would we say about fear, right? Fear is a great example of a basic emotion. So fear is supposed to indicate that something dangerous is going on. And when we feel fear, respiration increases, heart rate increases, we sweat a little bit, we get a little bit of goosebumps, right? You can feel the adrenaline sometimes, maybe you were watching some horror movies over the weekend, right? Halloween, get a bit of a thrill. And if you subtract away, think you're watching a horror movie or something, and you subtract away all of those bodily sensations that you experience, all that's left is a judgment. That's what James claimed anyway. Go ahead, Chelsea.
This might sound really silly, but is it, and maybe this will be answered the more I read, but it almost sounds like we're like, we understand that a door is a door, and it's made up of like wood and some metal handle and a hinge and stuff. And if you take it all apart, then yeah, it's just wood and stuff, or trees, I don't know. But like, it almost feels like if we're taking it apart so much, like sure, judgments might be part of it, but it's not necessarily like the emotion might require that. But to say that it is only that, I don't know. It feels, I don't know what it feels like. It just feels wrong.
Yeah, no, and that's not. I'm not going to go out and say that that's incorrect.
Okay.
But I will say that I think the reason that James is taking this approach, and likewise with Lange and later with Prince, Damasio, and all of those figures, is that, as we've discussed earlier in the class, there are clearly judgments that do not involve any kind of emotion, let alone any kind of phenomenology, right? So clearly judgments are not necessary, or rather not sufficient,
Right.
to have
Okay.
an
Yeah,
emotion.
yeah. For sure. Okay.
But as you say, perhaps they're necessary. And I'll just say, but maybe I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. This is what Jesse Prince does to try and kind of
Okay,
save
that's
the
what
theory.
yeah, I had a feeling that was okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
like you're just left with an unfelt judgment. What Prince says is no, those changes in body states, those are the judgments, right?
Okay, yeah, that's
Because
like, yeah.
because it's an
Okay.
embodied theory, situated cognition and all of that, right?
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So that is, I think, why the early perceptual theorists do what they do. But again, Prince comes along and says, well, James and Lange were on the right track. So is Richard Lazarus. It's just that, James is kind of leaving out judgments. Lazarus is leaving out the phenomenology. If we put them together, we get a perceptual theory of emotions where they are embodied judgments, right? So instead of having a mental representation, like if you're frightened, instead of having a mental representation that, there's a danger, it's
Uh-huh.
the physical feeling that is representing the danger. So,
Right.
and that's why I like this so much, because it's very very situated cognition, very extended
Mhm.
mind, very neat.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So to cover some of the advantages, well, firstly, James's theory places a lot of focus on the body. In fact, a central focus on the body, and so we get the felt qualities of emotions into the spotlight, which is what we want to do. And another cool thing about James's theory is that it presents emotions as phenomena that are not really very cognitively demanding, right? You don't have to be all that cognitively sophisticated to experience emotions on James's view, which means it's no problem, as opposed to some of the other theories that we've looked at, to say that children or non-human animals can experience emotions. If emotions, say, are really complicated value judgments, well, then how could animals have them, right? How could children have them? They might have basic ones, but there are some animals which clearly have a rich emotional life, like elephants, for example. So on this account, it brings the body and therefore the felt qualities of emotions into focus, and it also sort of widens the spotlight, not just to include humans, but other creatures too. And I think that's good. And to really put it all simply, it's not a complicated theory at all. The changes in our body states, our coming to be aware of those changes, most importantly, is the emotion. That is all constitutive of the emotion. Some people, and I think the authors mention this, some people think that James is sort of putting the cart before the horse. They kind of misunderstand him, and they'll think perhaps incorrectly that he's saying, like, maybe we start crying, and because we feel the tears stream down our face and our muscles tighten up, then we realize we're sad, or we feel our heart race and our blood boil and we realize we're angry, as if it's a feeling and then a judgment. But no, that's not what James is trying to say. James is saying, just crying is like a manifestation of the emotion of sadness. It's constitutive of sadness. So the changes and our coming to be aware of those changes is the emotion. And that's straightforward in some senses, and straightforward and not so straightforward in other senses. So Gracie has a good question here. Gracie asks, is there always changes in body states because of emotions? Some people literally cannot cry sometimes, even though they want to or need to. Like they know they're sad, but can't cry. LOL. Yes, I know I know what you mean there. The authors do have something to say about this coming up. Actually, I think it's on the next slide. So maybe I can answer your question by proceeding to the next slide. Oh, yes. Okay, so there are. Oh, yeah. Yeah, Gracie, actually, yes, that could absolutely be a reading response topic. Yeah, great suggestion. So one possible reading response 3 topic could be, are there unfelt emotions? That's an interesting question. So, and some of this here may help enable discussion of that. So I think I'll be able to answer your question more completely as I proceed through this slide. But yes, that is an excellent idea for a topic. I would, yeah, totally, no problem. Definitely do that if you wish. So James is trying to say rather straightforwardly that emotions are really just perceptions of changes in the body. And there are lots of different kinds of changes. I haven't listed them all, but obviously there are changes in respiration, skin response, facial expression, brain activity, heart rate, lots of different bodily changes, right? But if we say that emotions are just perceptions of these bodily changes, certain problems pop up. And one of those problems has to do with the question Gracie just asked. Problem number 1, it's just not clear whether all emotions are actually accompanied by bodily changes. This might be a slightly different question than whether there are unfelt emotions, but certainly similar. We can see in any case that James's theory works pretty well for emotions that are, so obviously involving changes in the body states, like anger or sadness, right? Like if we become angry, the face becomes flushed, the muscles tense, the breathing increases, you maybe feel some adrenaline, and you can see when someone's angry, you can tell. Likewise, when someone's sad, they might cry, they might have a downcast look on their face. You can usually tell when someone's experiencing one of these emotions. But there are other emotions, like, for example, hope or regret, which the authors mention, where it's not clear whether there are changes in bodily states that accompany these emotions. And also, again, very similar to what Gracie just said, sometimes we feel emotions so weakly that there might only be a small change in our somatic state, but we still say that we're experiencing an emotion, right? I mean, you can be very angry. I mean, if somebody commits some kind of horrible wrong against you, you might become very, very angry. But if some little thing just happens to not go your way, you might also become angry, but not as angry. You might just be a little angry, right? Is it the same for hope or regret? I don't know about that. I guess the question of whether we can feel emotions weakly is a different question from whether there are actually emotions that do not have bodily changes that accompany them. Maybe that's something we can talk about a bit in a moment. But another problem is that, in the medical literature, there is a wealth of information on people that have spinal cord injuries. And of course, the spinal cord, as part of the central nervous system, goes through the spine. And people with spinal cord injuries may not have as much access to, bodily feelings as people without spinal cord injuries. So I'm talking about perhaps somebody who maybe has had an injury and becomes a paraplegic or a quadriplegic, and perhaps they can't feel their extremities. They can't feel the same sorts of things that I can feel, but these folks have rich emotional lives. So is it really necessary that we need these changes in somatic states? All of these points taken together suggest that these peripheral responses, as the authors call them, and here what that means is peripheral responses in the peripheral nervous system, that's what they're talking about there, aren't really required for emotions. Now, maybe we can salvage the theory against these criticisms. Maybe. Of course, we're going to run into other criticisms, as we often do. But there are some things we can say, some counterpoints we can raise against the points I've just raised here. Excuse me. So Chelsea asks, might these changes need to be taken with language proficiency when considering the richness of their emotional life? In the example of people with spinal cord injuries, perhaps. I'm not aware of any research on that, though. But I have wondered if for example, there might be some kind of difference between people whose spinal cord injuries are acquired versus congenital. But I have to say I don't know. Yeah, I don't want to hazard an answer that's incorrect here. So, but yeah. So there are 3 points here that suggest maybe there's some problems, but we can probably do something about those problems. So that's okay. Let's see what we can do about them on the next slide. So some solutions are as follows. Peripheral responses, in the nervous system, might not be necessary to experience emotions. Now, when James is doing this work, it's the late 19th century, and neuroscience is not as advanced as it is today. We did have neuroscience. It was a discipline back then, but we didn't have the kinds of investigative tools that we have nowadays to actually see the brain in action, as it were, right? So James says that what you need are these changes in body states and the perception of those changes. Now the consensus has shifted so that maybe we don't need a change in the body state or a peripheral response. Maybe what we need instead is just activation of the right brain regions, right? And this is a sort of shortcut, right? This shortcut, and this is following from Antonio Damasio's work, might explain, on the one hand, weaker emotions, and emotions in those with spinal cord injuries, and also a whole range of other things. I'll just talk about the first two for a moment. Just think, for example, do another little thought experiment for yourself. Imagine, or, when you're really frightened, that feels like, you're really frightened. It's intense. But if you just imagine being frightened, that's not as intense, right? So that might explain why some emotions are weak. Your weak imagining of being afraid is because you're using this neural shortcut. You're not actually having a change in your peripheral nervous system, but the right regions of the brain are activated. And this could also explain the emotional lives of those who have spinal cord injuries. And as I said a moment ago, it can also occur, it can also explain why we can experience emotions when we, when we imagine things or when we empathize with people. We simulate. This is one theory of empathy, is that we engage in simulating. And how do we simulate? Well, we run things offline in the brain, basically. And that could explain why we need emotion, or why, we have weak emotions, and why people with spinal cord injuries have emotions as well. And this is a good point as well, Chelsea. If we think about actors channeling emotions, yeah, that's tricky for me to wrap my head around, because I don't know all that much about acting, but I understand there are different ways that actors will do this, right? Like method acting and so forth. So an actor could also, I suppose, draw from a memory to try and get into the right frame of mind to channel those emotions. But an actor might also try to get themselves into the right kind of bodily state, right? Like, as you just say here, like if you can make yourself cry but not actually be sad, maybe if you can, just chop some onions and get those tears going, maybe just that similarity of the body feeling can make you feel really sad. Maybe, again, like, I don't know about acting, but that's a good point. And I also think that the activation of the brain regions very obviously explains why, for example, dreams can give us emotionally intense experiences, because when you're dreaming, like, that's a completely offline process. There is so little sensory input coming in from the outside world that your dream is built from memories, expectations, and other things like that, not environmental stimuli. Yet we can still experience a response to those dream stimuli, right? And that's because in REM sleep, the brain is just as active as it is when we're awake. So yeah, that could be it. And obviously, certain drugs can affect one's emotional state, right? So all those 19th century libertines who like to drink wine and smoke opium all the time, right? Feeling really euphoric and kind of sleepy. Of course, adverse effects too. A lot of drugs can cause one to feel anxious, of course, after they cause that initial euphoria, right? So, for example, cannabis, of course, can elicit additional activity in brain regions that make you feel happy, that maybe make you feel a little hungry, but it can also make people feel anxious, right? And it's not like you're responding to an event in the environment. It's a change in your brain chemistry. So this seems to me to be quite plausible. So if this is all true, this might actually salvage James's theory. Emotions, we don't have to say that emotions are just perceptions of changes in body states. We can say that they're perceptions of changes in body states, or when there is no change in body state, it could be a sort of offline simulation of a change in body state that's realized by the activity and the right kinds of brain activity. But if we accept that all of this is true, we'd also have to reject the idea that there are unfelt emotions. There wouldn't really be unfelt emotions, just very, very, very weakly felt emotions. And I guess I'm kind of sympathetic to that, because when I think of emotions that the authors use as examples of unfelt emotions, like hope or regret, I don't know. I think there is something that it's like to feel those. I have a hard time saying what it is beyond just it feels like regret or it feels like hope. But it seems like there is something that it's like to hope for something. Does everybody, I don't know, do people agree? Or do some of you have unfelt emotions? Maybe my brain is just wired differently than yours. I don't know. I'd like to hear from people.
Do you want us to talk?
Yeah. If or type whatever people are comfortable with.
I definitely feel like, yeah, there is a what it is likeness. There's a feeling. It feels really feels intuitive to me.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think that's to say that we can't talk about emotions and imagine how they feel without feeling them. Like I think that's possible.
Yeah.
I do think that there's a distinction there though, and that part of emotions is that they are felt. I think that, yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, when I was doing that or redoing that thought experiment from William James, I just went back to some of those examples from our essay brainstorming lecture of sci-fi examples like Spock or Data or somebody, and how they'll it's all judgments and not a lot of feeling, right? If you take away all that
Yeah.
feeling, it's all
Mhm.
just like, oh, it is agreeable to see you today.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? So
That's right, yeah.
yeah, I don't know. It all
I
just seems
I
like that. Yeah.
I guess, to account for people who would say like I feel nothing. There is we would still talk about some sort of negative affectivity there, right? Like there is still feeling nothing. There is still a feeling there.
Yeah.
And that's where we'd be able to say that it's almost like it's a very faint something, but it could also be argued that it's so strong if it's bothering you, so if it's like it feels like such a weight that you're
Yeah.
feeling nothing, that in and of itself could be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, when I think of people who are depressed, for example,
Mhm.
and and maybe this is not so common anymore because there's so much more discourse about mental health now. But
Mm.
I remember, how I had this misconception myself years ago, when I was like a teenager, perhaps, that people who are depressed are just sad. But that's
Mhm.
not it.
That's right.
It's
No,
more
no.
like someone who's depressed might not even be able to cry if they were sad, but they
Mhm.
also can't feel happy,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But that in itself, as you suggest, also doesn't feel good, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So there is
So,
some sort of feeling to it, and then we get into
right.
moods and yeah.
Yeah,
Just a whole thing.
exactly. So I don't know, unfelt emotions. I think I'm okay with rejecting that idea. It's the same in philosophy of mind. People sometimes talk about unfelt pains. And I'm like, okay, but
Mm.
is that pain though? Like if I don't feel it,
Mm.
I don't know.
Yeah. I think I mean, there's so many things we could explore here with imagination and creativity and how that works if we're talking about pain, emotional pain specifically. People
Right.
think themselves into that kind of thing. Oh my God, my brain.
Yeah. So good possible essay/critical responses.
Yeah.
So and again, I just want to reiterate, like everybody, there is so much in this book. Like you don't, it's okay. Just pick a little tiny thing to talk about. It's okay. Like after this class is done, none of us are going to remember everything we learned. This book is that dense.
It's
This
so
is,
sad.
yeah. And I like it. It's a great reference, right? You can keep coming back to this book.
It's
This is why,
fantastic.
yeah, this is why doctors and lawyers have books
All
all
the
over the
books, yeah.
office.
Yeah,
So don't worry about it. Pick a
that's a
little
really good
tiny
point.
fun thing to talk about.
Yeah.
Now, Gracie says, uh, I think you can also unfeel emotions. For example, after really crazy emotional, taxing relationship full of tears, once you come to a breakup, you're of course sad and grieve it, but also are numb by this point and don't experience bodily responses like crying because you're so over it, even though you feel it. I think this could be an unfelt emotion. Okay, I see. I think I see what you're saying there. Like, you're still sad. You would still say you're sad if somebody asked you, but you've like cried so much that physically, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That might be one way that you could argue that an emotion is unfelt. It's not like you've never felt it, but you felt it. And if somebody asked you, you might say, oh, I'm still sad that I broke up with my partner after this thing, but you're not maybe manifesting it in the same way, I suppose. So yeah, that's a good counterpoint. I hadn't thought of that. And then Chelsea, again, could we say the emotion of calm comes over somebody? I wonder if calm, like feeling calm, I guess that could be an emotion. Yeah, I don't know. Because calm, I mean, calm, maybe calmness is like a mood, because calmness, once you've gotten the emotion out, then you become calm. Yeah. And so maybe in that case, you've moved from sadness as an emotion to sadness as a mood, which would have a different physical expression. That could be one way to argue it for like, Gracie and Chelsea and everyone who's thinking of this. Just one more comment from I felt emotions super intensely. I just don't feel like anything like anger. Yeah, like it's weird. Some emotions I experience way more intensely than others. I don't really get angry. I don't know why. I just, like, sometimes I'm like, I'm so angry, and then like 2 minutes later I'm like, it's fine, but when I'm happy, I'm like really happy for like the whole day. It's awesome. So I don't know, everybody's got a bit of a different emotional makeup that way, I suppose. Yeah, I guess it depends what elicits it too. I tend to feel emotions more intensely when I'm listening to music than when I'm with people. I don't know if that makes me some kind of psychopath or something, but oh no, it's not. No stability, not really. No. Just odd, but there are individual differences for everybody, right? And this is my point, right? I've I'll hang out with my buddy, my friend who I went to grad school with, and we'll put on music, right? And we're both sitting there like just air conducting, getting into it, just so intense. And it's better having more people to do that with and share the experience with. But then if it's some emotional stuff in real life, I don't know, I just don't get as emotional. It's weird. I don't know. So everyone's different. And some people are the opposite. Some people are like super sensitive to other people's emotions, and they don't care about like a beautiful piece of music or a wonderful piece of art, right? It doesn't affect them. They don't get it, I guess, right? So yeah, everybody's different. Everyone's different, and that's something that makes this even harder to get through, right? To get to the bottom of this. So let's see what's on the next slide. We do have further problems to contend with. One of those problems is that these internal perceptions, that is changes in our internal states, are actually sufficient to identify, that is, I read this as to individuate different emotions. As Deonna and Teroni put it here, they say that if emotions are nothing but bodily feelings, each emotion type must be distinguishable in terms of the feelings peculiar to it. And yet it is unclear whether bodily feelings are as emotion specific as the theory requires. So is there a fine-grained enough difference between what it's like to experience this emotion versus that emotion for us to say, well, these are different emotions? The authors mentioned pride and joy, right? Pride and joy, very similar, I assume similar kinds of emotions. Pride, well, we all know what pride is, and joy, I just like it because there's that song Pride and Joy. It's a good song. What else? Are those different enough? Like when you feel proud of something versus when you feel joy, how do you distinguish between the two by appealing to phenomenology? If you think about it, they feel pretty similar. So yeah, how do you distinguish?
Oh, sorry. I have a question about that.
Oh, go ahead.
Could like pride be more egotistical, where it's like you don't feel a difference, but like, for example, like let's say you do really well on like a test and you're like bragging to your friends, right?
Right.
And you're like prideful. You're also happy, so you're joyful at the same time, but you're also prideful. But to other people, to people outside looking in, if they think you're like showing off, or they think you're kind of being like pompous and like, I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, I think I see what you mean. I think
It's not that you recognize it as the same thing, but is it really the same thing? Like, is it more, does it come from more of a superficial place than the actual joyful place? That's what
yeah. Well, in either case, like if you're right, and this is kind of similar to some of the comments coming up in the chat now, if you're right about that, then that means that, yeah, the phenomenology isn't enough to distinguish them, right? Mm-hmm. Like, as you say, pride, at least in some cases, I wouldn't say egotistic, but maybe egocentric.
Yeah.
Just because you can feel, but then again, you can feel proud of other people too. So yeah,
right.
Yeah, like parents who are proud of their kids, right?
Right.
So, but I still think you're right that the difference seems to be
where it comes from.
Yeah, like the object of it, right?
Yeah.
Like it just, pride is maybe a certain kind of joy that we feel about certain things. Pride, over something we've accomplished, or something that somebody we care about has accomplished, or even of who we are in the face of some kind of attempt to shame. Like that's what like gay pride parades are about, right? I mean, because historically, LGBTQ people were made to feel ashamed of the way they were, and now instead we'll have a parade and celebrate, and then everybody can come, and it's, you also feel a lot of joy at a pride parade, right? Like, so yeah.
It's
but I think
complicated.
Yeah, I think we agree though that like that's a good example of the phenomenology of those emotions not really being different enough,
to distinguish,
to make that the means of distinguishing them. Yeah, and Chelsea, I believe, says the feeling of accomplishment. Yeah, so like pride over maybe who you are, like if you're like if you're marching in a gay pride parade, versus pride in an accomplishment, like I got that A+ in philosophy of emotions, right? So yeah, it's incredibly complicated. And joy, I don't know, joy, you can feel joy not because of something, like pride is kind of almost a moral emotion, because it's also about either who you are or what you've done. Joy isn't necessarily about that. Joy could be because somebody did something wonderful for you, maybe your partner proposes to you or something, and you just feel, yay, that's so awesome, and you just feel joy, right? Yeah. Chelsea in the chat says, or even feeling successful. Yeah, like if you're like the example I always go to here, It's another Star Trek example. But George Takei, right? Who was closeted for years, but just seems so like happy since he came out, you know, and that's about who he is and something he did. So yeah, like it's so complicated, but I think we all agree that yeah, there's something else perhaps besides the phenomenology when it comes to pride and joy. So I think we all agree on that. Okay, so where are we here? Oh yeah, well, we're almost done. I should say real quick that whether there actually are these fine-grained differences between similar emotions, this is actually an empirical question. I mean, we can sit here and think about it and do philosophy, but we also actually would need to go and do some studies, right? And these could be behavioral, physiological. We could do any number of different kinds of studies. We could even do neurological studies, right? See if there's some brain differences between pride and joy. But the point is, this is also very much an empirical question. Yeah, and we need psychologists, neuroscientists, and cognitive scientists to get in here and figure this out, right? So maybe in the future, one of you will be able to do this. That would be great. Now, there's also another version of the same problem, right? What about similarities between emotions and non-emotional states? Like if you feel ill and you feel sick to your stomach, maybe you've got motion sickness or something, right? That might feel similar to an episode of disgust where I present to you my spaghetti sauce that I'm making for dinner, and you hate spaghetti sauce and you feel disgusted and you retch and gag, perhaps. So that's, you know, kind of similar to an episode of, you know, feeling ill. Maybe you've got motion sickness or food poisoning, right? So what is it that makes one an emotion and the other not an emotion, right? That's another version of the same problem. And another thing that the authors point out towards the end of the section is that experiences like the one I've just mentioned aren't really directed at our own body, the case of disgust, but at an object that makes us feel disgusted, right? And that gets us to a problem, another problem. Emotions, on James's theory, are supposed to be directed at things, but that's something that also lies at the heart of the evaluative judgment theory, right? Emotions have content, they have intentionality, they are directed at people, events, objects. And we've seen that there are problems with the evaluative judgment theory, but also this insight that we've just come back to is, you know, is very important. We can't avoid it. So maybe what we need to do is kind of combine the two somehow. And that's what the rest of the chapter is about. But anyway, Deonna and Teroni say of these phenomena that we've just been discussing, they say that they are so clearly incompatible with the idea that an emotion is nothing but a perception of the changes in our own body, is enough to reject this model, and is a principal motivation behind contemporary theories that seek to reconcile, in one way or another, the thought that emotions are distinctive modes of apprehending salient features of the environment with the thought that they are essentially felt. So, and that's what Prince does, basically. Emotions are embodied value judgments. They're felt, and that feeling is the judgment. And that's, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. That's why I like it so much. So thinkers like Prince, Damasio, a little bit more. Damasio's a neuroscience guy, by the way. If any of you are not familiar with him, I highly recommend you check out his book, Descartes' Error. And he talks in that book about a lot of the brainy stuff, the neuroscience of emotion, and emotions' roles in thinking, i.e., making judgments, right? He talks about all kinds of interesting stuff like Phineas Gage and all kinds of interesting cases like that, and how, in particular, moral reasoning is affected when our emotions are affected. So very cool stuff there. All right. So question in the chat. Yeah, doesn't he have funky hair? He has a, well, I don't know. It's always changing colors, I think. But yeah, Prince is an interesting guy. I've always regretted that I've never had a chance to meet him. One day I'll get to pick his brain. But so that's it for today. Geez, I guess you know, I don't know where he works. Last time I know he was at City University of New York for a while. But I think he's somewhere else now. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
There's nothing on Wikipedia right now, really, about where he is. Like usually you get a little profile on folks when you Google them.
Yeah,
Yeah, as you said, the last thing was the City University of New York.
I want to say University of Chapel Hill in North Carolina,
Okay.
because that's what it was in Gut Reactions, if I remember. But yeah, I don't know. I'll find out for next time, but anyway, yeah, that's all. So I guess it was probably a wise idea to keep this short, because that was actually really dense. I didn't think that was going to be that dense.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
You mentioned the simulating emotions with empathy. Is there anywhere specific that I could find more information on that? A specific book or something, or person?
Well, yeah, who was I talking about? Oh, it wasn't this class. But my old supervisor, Heidi Maybach.
I thought you were gonna bring her up. Okay.
Yeah. She's got a really good paper. It's called The Many Faces of Empathy and Their Relation to Pro-Social Behavior and Aggression Inhibition, I think.
Wow. What a book. What's a paper? Okay.
Anyway, just or the chapter, the first chapter of her book, Empathy and Morality, is called Almost Everything You Wanted to Know About Empathy. Also, her paper, The Presence of Others.
Okay.
That's where I started with all of this stuff. But you can go further back if you want to get really philosophical. Another really classic source on this is Alvin Goldman.
Okay.
So Alvin Goldman talks about simulation. Simulation is basically using introspection. Introspection, of course, how we understand how we're feeling, and we can use that to simulate, either by putting ourselves in the other person's shoes, so imagining that we were them, or imagining that it's us, but just in the same situation.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And then there's also theory. So that's simulation theory. Then there's theory, which is theory of mind, which is probably what you're more familiar with as a psychic.
Yeah.
So you know that stuff already. Sacha Baron Cohen or Simon.
Yeah. There was another thing that you mentioned that I wanted to ask you about book-wise. Oh, no. Was it Prince's book? What's it? I think you already told us what Prince's book was called.
Gut Reactions.
Gut Reactions.
A perceptual theory of emotion.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's, yeah. And anybody message me at any time on the Discord server if you want book suggestions, you know, because I've got a mental list that's quite long. So if anyone needs any suggestions, yeah, I'm happy to help out.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
And do you know of any research that has been done on, I'm going to stop asking these questions. I keep asking them in all of my classes. Language proficiency. Is everyone okay?
Oh yeah, I think it's just, she's just barking at the neighbors.
Okay. Language proficiency in relation to emotions. Like, are you familiar with any work about that? Is that going to be just directly like embedded in any of these theories that we're talking about here?
You know, I'm not sure. I don't know if the authors talk about that at all, but Yeah, see, I mean, I don't know, but that's an interesting question, because there's a couple of different ways you could tackle language proficiency, right?
Hmm.
Like, are we talking about people just getting better and more proficient at language as they age? Are we talking about people who have a lower or higher verbal IQ? Yeah, like, what are we talking about there? I
I
would think that language, I mean, I know you have a couple copies of Andy Clark's Mindware.
I do. I've been reading it.
So yeah, so I
Yeah.
would go right to the cognitive technology stuff.
Okay.
And because language gives us more ways to talk about things and can
Hmm.
help us to assimilate more complex concepts,
Hmm.
you know, second, third order concepts. And we can represent these using language as a sort of label for that concept that
Right.
maybe somebody who is nonverbal wouldn't be able to do, right?
Right.
So
Right. Yeah.
yeah, this is just my hypothesizing here, but I don't know of anything certain, but that's just kind of like where my brain goes when you say that.
That's no, that's fantastic. I think because what I'm kind of comparing it to in my head, again, all of this is related to therapy. Like I just care about theories of therapy and how we can make therapy better. Specifically, like if you think about what philosophy does, or just education in general, and how it clarifies our understandings of the world, and we'll have an initial understanding of something, and then we will learn more about it, and then maybe it will turn into three different things. And so my wonderingment is that maybe there's an emotion that is different from the emotions that they like will become once you can label them.
Yeah, yeah,
Like it's almost muddy, and it's like, is it a different thing and we can't label it? Is it because that, like, is there a level of confusion that then almost
yeah.
changes it?
And this is of course why people do like dialectical therapy and stuff, right? Like,
Right,
to
yeah.
it's very much like doing philosophy if you're putting your Socrates hat on.
Yeah.
um it's kind of the same thing. I've even remarked this to counselors before, where I say, like, this is a lot like philosophy, actually. um
Mhm.
um so yeah, that I think there's something there. I apologize that I don't know any
No, no,
good
no, no. It's good. It's
materials,
good you've
but
been able to direct me again to another part in that book, because I went straight to the extended mind chapter,
right,
or extended
which
cognition,
is
chapter
that?
9.
Let's see.
Um,
So cognitive technology is chapter 8. Okay, so right before that one, chapter 8.
okay.
I would check that out.
Okay. Yeah, I will. I love the way he writes too. It's very
Very
uh
engaging.
oh yeah, straight to the point and engaging, and
It's
yeah.
a lot different than our textbook.
It's a little bit more conversational, I'd
Yeah,
say.
which I
Uh
like.
yeah, but I do appreciate how surgical this one is. So,
Yeah, but
yeah.
this one is Clark. You can read through once and retain a lot of it. This one, you
Yeah.
got to come back to it. It's like a doctor book that you keep on your bookshelf behind your desk.
Oh, but
So
so good. So good. My countertops have received many a lecture on these chapters so far.
excellent, excellent.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
next time, then
Thank you.
we'll just continue on. Oh, these are leaves that are. I'm seeing these weird things falling. They're leaves.
Leaves just
Yeah,
from.
from a plant.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay. I wasn't sure
yeah.
I thought they were coming in from outside.
No, no,
Okay.
luckily no. It's this plant here. Well, I better go clean those up. But yeah, next time we'll look at hopefully the next two sections, but this is another one of those dense chapters, so we may have to go into next week with this and revise the schedule a little bit, but hopefully not. So I'll see you guys all next time, and of course, if anyone has any questions, let me know.
Thank you.
Welcome, then see you all next time.